The United States spent 20 years in Vietnam, deployed over 3 million soldiers, dropped more bombs than in all of World War II combined, lost 58,318 Americans, and still lost the war. Then, 50 years later, Vietnam became one of America's most important trade partners in Asia. So the question is not just why America couldn't win in Vietnam. The real question is this: what exactly did America lose? Vietnam does not look like a superpower killer on paper. Its entire landmass is roughly the size of California. In 1965, its GDP per capita was one of the lowest in the world. It had no aircraft carriers, no strategic bombers, no satellite intelligence, and no nuclear weapons. Its primary weapons in the early stages of the war were rifles, bicycles, and shovels. And yet, over the course of 20 years, it absorbed the full military weight of the most powerful nation on Earth and did not break. The answer has nothing to do with weapons. It has everything to do with geography, ideology, and a calculation about time and cost that the United States was simply not willing to match. To understand Vietnam, you have to understand the world in 1954. The Cold War was not a theory, it was a lived reality. China had just fallen to Mao's communists in 1949. Korea had just been divided at the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union had the bomb. American policymakers were terrified. And they had a theory, called the Domino Theory, that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, its neighbors would follow, one by one, like dominoes. Vietnam was the first domino. The logic was simple. Lose Vietnam, lose Laos, lose Cambodia, lose Thailand, lose the entire region. That fear, more than any other single factor, is what drove the United States into 20 years of war. And as we'll see, the dominoes never fell. Before a single battle was fought, the geography of Vietnam was already working against the US military. Vietnam is not open terrain. It is dense tropical jungle covering more than 65% of its land area, with thick canopy blocking aerial observation, narrow river deltas flooding without warning, and a coastline riddled with impossible to secure inlets. In the Central Highlands, mountains rise to over 9,000 feet. Air superiority, America's greatest tactical advantage, was dramatically neutralized. You cannot bomb what you cannot see. You cannot hold ground you cannot find on a map. And in a country where the enemy could vanish into a jungle within seconds of an ambush, the most advanced military machine in history found itself swinging its shadows. "30 miles northwest of Saigon, beneath a region called Cu Chi, the Viet Cong built one of the most remarkable military engineering feats in human history, a tunnel network stretching over 250 kilometers underground. Not just passageways, an entire underground civilization. Field hospitals, weapons factories, command centers, kitchens designed to vent smoke horizontally through the earth so it could not be detected from above. American forces walked over these tunnels every day. They called the area a free fire zone and bombed it relentlessly. The tunnel survived. The fighters inside moved to attack, then disappeared back underground before a response could be mounted. The US Army eventually deployed specialists called tunnel rats, soldiers who crawled into the darkness armed with only a pistol and a flashlight. The tunnels are still there today. They have become a tourist attraction.
As you know, on August 2nd, and again
in 1965, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara introduced a new metric for measuring progress in Vietnam. Not territory held, not population secured, not political stability achieved. Body count, the number of enemy soldiers killed. McNamara, a former Ford Motor Company executive, believed that war, like a business, could be optimized through data. If they killed enough enemy combatants, North Vietnam would eventually run out of people willing to fight. The problem was the math. North Vietnam was willing to absorb losses at a rate that no American political system could match. Ho Chi Minh had already stated it plainly, "You can kill 10 of my men for every one I kill of yours, but even at those odds, you will lose and I will win." He was right. And the body count metric made everything worse, creating pressure on commanders to inflate numbers, to count civilian deaths as enemy combatants, to manufacture progress that did not exist. On a street corner in Saigon on June 11, 1963, a 66-year-old Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down in the middle of an intersection, poured gasoline over himself, and lit himself on fire. He did not move, he did not make a sound. The photograph taken by AP journalist Malcolm Brown was transmitted around the world within hours. President Kennedy, upon seeing it, said, "No news picture in history has generated so much emotion." This was not an act of despair, it was a protest against the South Vietnamese government's brutal suppression of Buddhism, the very government the United States was spending billions to support. The world asked a simple question: if this is what America's ally looks like, what exactly is America defending? It was 1963. The United States had not yet sent combat troops. The war had not truly begun. And already, the moral foundation was cracking. Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. In January 1968, the U.S. military command had just told Congress that the war was going well. General Westmoreland declared that the enemy was unable to mount a major offensive. On January 31, 1968, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army launched coordinated attacks on over 100 cities across South Vietnam simultaneously. They stormed the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. They attacked the presidential palace. They fought their way into the ancient imperial city of Hue, which they held for 26 days. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was a catastrophic failure for North Vietnam. They lost over 45,000 troops. But that is not what the American public saw. They saw the U.S. Embassy, the symbol of American power in Vietnam, under attack, on television, in real time. The credibility of the entire war effort collapsed in a single night. On June 8, 1972, Associated Press photographer Nick Ut was covering operations near the village of Trang Bang. A South Vietnamese aircraft mistakenly dropped napalm on the road where civilians were fleeing. Nick Ut raised his camera. The photograph he took showed a 9-year-old girl, Kim Phuc, running down the road, arms outstretched, clothes burned completely off her body, screaming in pain. The image won the Pulitzer Prize. It appeared on the front page of every major newspaper in the world. Kim Phuc survived. Nick Ut drove her to the hospital himself. The photograph did not end the war alone, but it crystallized something that years of political debate had failed to communicate, that beneath the strategy and the statistics and the geopolitical theory, real children were on fire, and America's military was connected to that fire. On the morning of March 16, 1968, U.S. Army soldiers from Charlie Company entered the village of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province. They had been told the village harbored Viet Cong. They found women, children, and elderly men preparing breakfast. Over the next 4 hours, between 347 and 504 unarmed Vietnamese civilians were killed. Women were raped before being shot. Children were executed. The entire village was burned. It was not a battle. There was no enemy fire. It was a massacre. The U.S. Army initially reported it as a successful combat operation. For over a year, the story was buried. It was only when soldier Ron Riddenhauer, who had heard accounts from other veterans, wrote a detailed letter to Congress, and when journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story in November 1969, that the world learned the truth. Only one officer was ever convicted. Lieutenant William Calley served 3.5 years under house arrest. My Lai did not just damage the war's reputation, it damaged the American military's moral authority in a way that took decades to rebuild. Vietnam was the first war in history fought under the constant, unfiltered eye of television cameras. In previous wars, Korea, World War II, the government controlled most of what citizens saw. In Vietnam, journalists had near unrestricted access. Every evening on the nightly news, Americans watched footage of the war in their living rooms. Body bags loaded onto helicopters, villages being burned with cigarette lighters, injured soldiers, crying civilians. The Cronkite moment is legendary. In February 1968, CBS anchor Walter Cronkite, the most trusted man in America, traveled to Vietnam after Tet and broadcast an editorial. He said the war appeared to be a stalemate. President Lyndon Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." 2 months later, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. No weapon, no battle, no military operation did more damage to the American war effort than a television camera pointed at the truth. The United States military in Vietnam operated on a rotation system, 12 months in country, then home. Most American soldiers were draftees, young men legally required to serve, many of whom did not understand why they were there or what victory would even look like. By 1971, drug use among U.S. troops in Vietnam was severe. Combat refusals were increasing. Fragging, the murder of officers by their own soldiers, was becoming a documented phenomenon. On the other side of the jungle, Vietnamese fighters had grown up in a country that had been colonized or occupied almost continuously for 1,000 years. First by China, then by France, then by Japan, then by France again. For them, fighting a foreign military on their own soil was not a political position. It was a way of life handed down across generations. One side needed to win the war. The other simply needed to not stop fighting. That is not a fair contest. The United States was not fighting alone in South Vietnam. It was fighting for South Vietnam, a government it hoped would become a stable, democratic ally in Southeast Asia. That government was a serious problem. Between 1963 and 1965, South Vietnam experienced 9 different governments in 24 months. Corruption was systemic. Billions in American aid were diverted by officials into private accounts. Rural populations, where the real war was being fought, had almost no loyalty to Saigon. The South Vietnamese army, trained and equipped by the US, suffered from massive desertion rates. In 1975, when North Vietnamese forces advanced south, entire South Vietnamese divisions collapsed without firing a shot. You cannot save a government that cannot save itself, and the United States spent 20 years learning that lesson, one expensive, bloody step at a time. Between 1965 and 1968, the United States launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, designed to destroy its military infrastructure and force it to negotiate. Over 3 years, U.S. aircraft flew over 300,000 sorties and dropped approximately 643,000 tons of bombs on North Vietnam. For context, that is more than the total tonnage dropped by the United States in the entire Pacific theater during World War II. The results were devastating for the civilian population. For the military objective, they were minimal. North Vietnam adapted with remarkable speed. Factories were dispersed into the countryside. Supply routes were repaired within days. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, the lifeline of the entire war effort, was bombed continuously and continuously rebuilt. A country running on bicycles and human labor proved more resilient than a country running on air power. Every bomb that missed a supply depot and hit a village created new enemies. Force without precision does not win wars. It manufactures them. In June 1971, the New York Times began publishing excerpts from a classified Department of Defense study, the Pentagon Papers. 7,000 pages of internal government analysis documenting U.S. decision-making in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968. What they revealed was devastating. The U.S. government had known for years that the war was not winnable at any acceptable cost. They knew the bombing campaigns were not working. They knew South Vietnam's government was too weak to sustain itself. They knew the American public was being misled about the actual progress of the war. They continued the war anyway. 4 administrations, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, had escalated a conflict they privately doubted, while publicly claiming progress. The papers were leaked by Daniel Ellsberg, a former Defense Department analyst who had worked on them, and could no longer stay silent. Nixon tried to stop publication. The Supreme Court said no. The papers did not just expose the Vietnam War, they exposed the gap between what governments say and what they know. That gap has never fully closed. By 1973, the United States had signed the Paris Peace Accords and begun withdrawing its forces. The policy of Vietnamization, training South Vietnamese soldiers to take over the fight, was the exit strategy. It failed. On April 29, 1975, North Vietnamese forces were closing in on Saigon. The United States launched Operation Frequent Wind, the largest helicopter evacuation in history. Over 19 hours, U.S. military and civilian helicopters made over 680 flights, evacuating approximately 7,000 people from rooftops across the city. The image of a CIA contract helicopter hovering over a downtown Saigon building while crowds of Vietnamese climbed a ladder to board became one of the defining photographs of the 20th century. By the morning of April 30, it was over. North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace. The war, which had cost the United States approximately $843 billion in today's money, had ended exactly as the Pentagon papers had predicted it would.
In 1995, 20 years after the fall of Saigon, Robert McNamara published a memoir. It was called In Retrospect: The Tragedy and Lessons of Vietnam. McNamara, the architect of American strategy in Vietnam, the man who had pushed the body count metric, the man who had overseen the escalation from 16,000 advisors to 543,000 combat troops, admitted that he had been wrong. "We were wrong, terribly wrong," he wrote. "We owe it to future generations to explain why." Vietnam veterans were furious. Many could not forgive him. In 2003, documentary filmmaker Errol Morris filmed McNamara in a series of extraordinary interviews released as The Fog of War. An 85-year-old man, on camera, confronting his own decisions, crying. There is no equivalent in modern history. A former Secretary of Defense, the man who ran a war that killed 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese, saying publicly, "We should never have been there." The lessons he identified were clear. Empathize with your enemy. Rationality will not save you. There's something beyond oneself. Maximize efficiency. Get the data. Argue and be wrong.
Here's the historical fact that rarely makes it into Vietnam War documentaries. The Domino Theory, the central justification for American involvement, was wrong. Vietnam fell to communism in 1975. Thailand did not fall, Malaysia did not fall, Indonesia did not fall, the Philippines did not fall, Singapore became one of the wealthiest nations in Asia. The dominoes that American policymakers had been terrified of, the chain reaction that justified 20 years of war, did not happen. Moreover, within just 4 years of the American withdrawal, Vietnam went to war with communist Cambodia and then with communist China. The unified communist Vietnam was not a Soviet puppet. It was a nationalist state that fought its supposed allies. The entire premise of the war, that a communist Vietnam meant a communist Southeast Asia, turned out to be historically false. 58,318 Americans died. Millions of Vietnamese died for a threat that never materialized. In 1995, 20 years after the fall of Saigon, the United States and Vietnam normalized diplomatic relations. Today, Vietnam is one of the fastest growing economies in Asia. It manufactures goods for Nike, Apple, and Samsung. It is a major destination for US and international investment. Bilateral trade between Vietnam and the United States exceeds $100 billion per year. Young Vietnamese have overwhelmingly positive views of Americans. A 2014 Pew Research poll found that 76% of Vietnamese had a favorable view of the United States, one of the highest rates anywhere in Asia. Vietnam is not a Soviet satellite. It is not exporting communist revolution across Southeast Asia. It is building factories, attracting foreign investment, and integrating itself into the global economy that the United States leads. America lost the war, and 50 years later, it got almost everything it was fighting for. The deepest lesson of Vietnam is not about military tactics. It is about the difference between winning wars and achieving outcomes. And sometimes history does both without any connection between them. Vietnam is not just a chapter in a history book. It is the event that permanently reshaped how America thinks about military power, about government trust, about the gap between intention and outcome. Every major American military intervention since, from the Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Iran, has been debated through the lens of Vietnam. Is this another Vietnam? Do we have an exit strategy? Is the public being told the truth? Those questions, born from the jungles of Southeast Asia, still echo in every policy debate, every military briefing, every election cycle today. Vietnam did not just cost America 58,000 lives and nearly $1 trillion. It cost something harder to measure and harder to recover: the certainty that American power, correctly applied, would always produce American outcomes. That certainty, once gone, does not fully return. Because the most important news today almost always started decades ago, and Vietnam is still speaking. If this video changed how you think about Vietnam, or about what power, loss, and history actually mean, leave a comment below. Subscribe if you want more history that explains the world you are living in right now. Because the decisions being made in Washington today are being made by people who grew up in the shadow of Vietnam, and they are still trying to learn from it. See you in the next one.